You pray, you wait, and nothing happens. It feels like dropping a heavy stone into a bottomless chasm, waiting for an echo that never comes. The silence can be deafening. This experience is documented thousands of years ago in the ancient texts of Jerusalem. A man named Asaph, a prominent worship leader in King David's own court, found himself engulfed in a profound crisis of faith. Even with direct proximity to the center of his religion, he felt entirely abandoned. In Psalm 77, Asaph writes that his distress was so severe it broke him physically. He lay awake all night, unable to speak, his spirit exhausted. He was so consumed by his anguish that he actively refused to be comforted. Spiritual despair and the feeling of divine abandonment is an ancient human condition, recorded by one of history's most dedicated religious leaders. Asaph's record reveals a fascinating paradox. In the middle of this crisis, the very act of thinking about God actually made his pain worse. He was looking back at happier days of close fellowship and measuring God entirely by his current suffering. He was viewing the divine strictly through the lens of what he lacked in the moment. This illustrates what happens when emotions shape theology. When we swap out God at the center of our spiritual orbit and place ourselves there instead, faith and truth lose their gravity and crash into chaos. Caught in this inward collapse, Asaph's thoughts turn to himself. He questions if God's promises have failed, if his mercy is gone, and if his faithful love ceased forever. When we make our own comfort and desires the center of our faith, an unanswered prayer feels like a targeted betrayal. At the climax of the psalm, Asaph recognizes that his own perspective has become entirely distorted. He makes a forceful, deliberate choice. He stops dwelling on his current circumstances and decides to intentionally look backward at God's historical actions. He anchors his mind to a specific historical moment. The Israelites trapped between the desert mountains and the deep waters of the Red Sea during the Exodus. Asaph cites legal, historical precedent, using God's past deliverance as raw evidence of his capability and faithfulness. Breaking the cycle of despair requires an active, forceful redirection of attention away from present feelings. Looking back at that deliverance, Asaph observes that God's path went through the vast water, yet his footprints were unseen. In the middle of the violent, crashing waves and the chaos of the storm, God's exact methods were invisible. God's ways were unseen in the terrifying moment, but his faithful character was undeniable in the final outcome. Asaph's physical circumstances in the present day have not changed at all. He is in the same pain, yet his despair has given way to quiet confidence and rest. Spiritual healing comes not because the circumstances improve, but because the perspective regarding who is in control shifts. Centuries later, in the Greco-Roman world of the early church, the Apostle Paul faced an identical struggle. In his second letter to the Corinthians, Paul describes a severe thorn in his flesh. He desperately pleaded with God 3 separate times to take the pain away. God refused to remove the pain, but promised that his grace was sufficient and that his power is perfected in human weakness. Paul, mimicking Asaph, had to stop insisting on his own way and intentionally align himself with God's broader purposes. God's refusal to remove a thorn serves as an invitation to rely entirely on his sustaining grace when personal strength reaches its limit. The experiences of Asaph and Paul demonstrate that God is not a transactional entity who exists to fulfill our personal desires. Firmly, faith rests entirely on who God is, rather than on what we receive from him. As this timeline illustrates, establishing solid lines back to specific points of past faithfulness instantly stabilizes a volatile present. Identify one unanswered prayer today and pray for strength to surrender to God's will, rather than asking him to conform to yours. When we stop forcing God to align with our plans, we are finally free to experience the profound peace of trusting his unchanging character.